Forced into bondage, many of these African prisoners were forced to work as slaves on plantations. Plantations were the large estates of the wealthy planter upper class. These plantations cultivated raw goods, oftentimes crops. One such plantation I'll be exploring during the peak of slavery is that of our own chief founding father. This, of course, being the Mount Vernon Plantation, residence of President George Washington. Mount Vernon resides in Virginia. The land was purchased by George Washington's direct great-grandfather, John Washington. It then passed to his grandfather, whose death sparked a splitting of the land between the sons, with George Washington's father keeping the bulk of the land. Washington's father, Augustine, is who first set up the tobacco plantation on the land. However, at this time, it was small and was named the Lentil Hunting Creek Tobacco Plantation. When Augustine died, the land fell to Washington's older brother, Lawrence. Lawrence would then rename the finished plantation and land to what we know now as Mount Vernon. Before moving on to Washington's management of the plantation, I would like to give context to the slave industry at the time. The international importation of slaves into the United States was not banned until 1808, meaning that the Washington family was likely getting slaves directly from Africa as well as domestically. However, these imported slaves were often seasoned in the Caribbean first. This seasoning process was brutal, and once slaves were fully broken into, they could then be sold to the domestic Americas. This meant that the planter upper class of Virginia, such as the Washingtons, could easily continue their work with broken-in slaves. My point of this is that even in the early peak of slavery, this system seemed unstoppable. The slave industry controlled all other industries as it held over raw goods. Now, after Lawrence's death, the estate fell into the hands of George, who had already been managing the estates. Let no mistake be made. Every slaver was brutal, and there were no gentle slavers. Slaves cultivating tobacco worked day in and day out as it was a cash crop. It was heavily labor intensive. Tobacco is planted and grown early in the season, and once ripe, the leaves have to be delicately harvested. Unlike most crops, the job is not done after harvesting, as the tobacco then has to be cured. After the curation of the tobacco, the ground is tilled and prepared for the next harvest. All this is to say that slaves on Mount Vernon Plantation had a very hard job ahead every single harvest. The estate itself was at its peak under George as it was turned into a mansion. The estate had a multitude of beautiful interiors. There was both an upper garden to the north and a lower garden on the south. That, of course, was reserved for the Washington family. The working areas of the estate were far less glamorous. Washington owned a total of 5 farms on the estate, all ran by slaves. These were the slave quarters. It is some injustice that while the Washington lived in mansions, those who worked stayed in bunks and cabins. The plantation would eventually switch to grain as it was less labor intensive. The death of George Washington ended the peak of Mount Vernon. Washington's will stated that slaves that would be inherited by his wife should be emancipated. These slaves, which resembled about half of the estate, were now free men. The estate would decline in the coming years due to poor management. As so, the estate shrunk. The estate was finally purchased by the federal government and turned into the museum we see today, giving it a second life.